Portcullis House, line 3.
Well, there seem to be quite a lot of people here this morning. There are a few chairs right in the front row, but I somehow think that there won't be many takers for those from the audience today. Thank you very much for coming, and Happy New Year, and congratulations on your appointment. We've got quite a lot of ground to cover on remuneration, of course, on the question of systemic risk and bank regulation, and also on retail banking competition. Could I just begin by asking you, is Barclays too big to fail?
No, we don't think so. I think, first of all, Chairman, Happy New Year to you and to the committee as well. And thank you for your comments about my new role. I am very, very excited. I am incredibly honored. Barclays took its first deposits in the City of London in 1690. That's a daunting 320 years of history, and I'm both honored and very, very motivated in the new role, so thank you. No, I don't think Barclays is too big to fail, and I think, you know, that's a simple answer. Let me give a little bit more color around it. I think the business model that we employ of the integrated universal banking model is an important starting position, and it gives us great diversification of earnings, great diversification of our clients, but also great diversification of our deposits, both institutional and retail, of our funding sources. We just raised money in dollars in the U.S. Late last week. So that diversification is a very, very important part of being financially stable. The second thing I would say, and I've said this consistently, is no bank should ever be a burden on the taxpayer. And so we have to make the system safer and sounder. And I think that's about risk management. And banks that failed, if there was something that was consistent, it was poor risk management. And I think we've done things around risk management and around regulation so that there's less risk of outsized losses at banks. I think, secondly, it's about the capacity to absorb losses. And I think that goes behind a lot of what the regulators have been focused on in terms of Basel III and Dodd-Frank. And then even when there's a bank such as Barclays, which is so strong and so well diversified, what if is the question that the regulators would have. What if the worst happened and that bank got into trouble? Then we need resolution and recovery plans. I can tell you that we at Barclays are working very closely with the FSA on just that. I know people talk about the need for regulators to be able to unwind an institution in short order, and we agree with that ambition. There's really two choices. for regulators, and that's to have not to have large, complex banking organizations. And our view is that the reason that we need those is for jobs and economic growth. The reason that we need, banks such as Barclays is because our clients are bigger, our clients are more international. More of the business they do is in China, in India, and in Africa. So what we do need is we need a plan to be able to resolve banks that get into trouble, and those are the plans that we're working on with the FSA.
If Barclays did get into trouble, how would you, as the chief executive, lose out?
Well, I think what's clear is if any banking institution got into trouble, the ultimate, where you look first is at the chief executive and at the risk management of the institution. And I think that's been the case when we've seen banks fail, whether it's here in the UK or around the world during this period.
Okay, but how would you lose out?
Well, I would assume I would lose out by both losing my job and losing any shares that I had in the company.
This is under the clawback agreement that you've signed.
Yeah, and I think that's
been disclosed in the company accounts.
Yes, I think that's how the compensation programs work, right?
The public's liability, though, is unlimited, isn't it? But your liability is limited to the clawback. Isn't that right?
Well, I think I'd like to back this up just a little bit if we can. I think the important thing in discussing the business models of banks, talking about competition and talking about choice, is that Barclays has very strong risk management. Barclays has an appropriate business model, the integrated universal banking model. So any discussion here that Barclays could get in trouble is surprising.
Well, it may be surprising, but we just had several banks go down, and as a result, the taxpayers footed a huge bill. So it's not surprising, I think, that we're discussing it, is it?
Well, and Chairman, I guess in direct answer to your question, is there a process for regulators in place going forward to resolve financial institutions that get in trouble? And I think that's a function of supervision in how banks manage themselves. It's a function of the new capital rules and the new regulations and the changes that have been made in terms of the financial architecture. And I think it's about resolution and recovery. And I was in Basel over the weekend where there was a meeting on just this subject with the G20 regulators and finance ministers. Central Bank Governor Draghi, as you know, is chairing the FSB and chairing just this initiative, and I think this is important for the regulators in the industry to resolve.
You do accept, though, that the risks to the senior executives are limited, whereas the risks to the taxpayer are unlimited.
Yes, and we also agree that no taxpayer money should ever be. It's not okay for taxpayers to have to bail out banks. Banks should be allowed to fail, and that's if banks have bad management, then they should be allowed to fail. We completely agree.
Would you examine risky deals in exactly the same way if your shirt was on the line?
I'm sorry?
Would you examine risky deals in exactly the same way if you had unlimited liability, if your shirt was on the line?
Sure. I mean, I think what you're coming back to is at Barclays or at a financial institution, how do we manage risk, both in terms of the governance of risk appetite, the scale and scope of risks that we'll take in various businesses, and I think what we look back on is in the most difficult times of the financial crisis, when the UK stressed banks, Barclays stayed above minimum capital requirements. When Europe later stressed all the banks, Barclays was the only large bank whose capital increased under the stress. So I think we're consistent in agreeing that risk management is the single most important thing that we can do, along with strong regulation, to ensure that taxpayers never have to put money in banks again.
You've said that you take exactly the same approach to risk if your shirt was on the line. Don't you think it would give the public reassurance if the shirts of the top CEOs and others at the top of banking did have their shirts on the line in the way they used to with unlimited liability?
I think there is, I agree with you, I think there's significant risk for chief executives and senior executives in the way the compensation programs work, in the way the shares in the company work, and in terms of losing their jobs.
Yeah, but I'm suggesting an increase in that risk. Are you agreeing with me that that risk should become unlimited?
I think we have many people that...
I'm not saying that it should. I'm positing the thought, and I'm asking you whether you think that's something that we should consider.
I think that's something that our owners should decide.
And have the shareholders been in touch with you about the remuneration and bonus package this year?
We haven't made decisions on bonuses for this year. The board will be meeting over the next couple of weeks on pools and allocation of pools. But having said that, our owners, our shareholders, are continuously involved from the point of view of how we govern it, how we run our businesses. They ultimately approve the remuneration report.
But have they asked you are they engaging with you in a discussion about your bonus structure this year?
In terms of the structure, we have had continuous discussions with the shareholders, and I think if I can back up a second to explain that more. So what are the kinds of things that we discuss with the shareholders around compensation? Compensation is pay for performance, not pay for failure. Compensation is in line with G20, with FSB, and with FSA guidelines. We were early to adopt those. Many of those we had in place already. We discussed with our shareholders that the governance process in place at Barclays, which is that we have an independent remuneration committee of the board that approves those.
May I just ask a more specific question? Do the shareholders have available to them at present the information of the type that Sir David Walker thinks should be more widely disclosed? Have they asked for that information?
Well, we haven't determined those. We haven't determined the pools or the allocation of pools yet.
But if they're going to be engaged in the discussion, as you suggested earlier, then presumably they need the information before you take the board decision.
Well, I think they get the information in just the way I described. What you're asking, Chairman, is about. Are you asking about the Walker Review?
Yes, I'm asking you whether that level of disclosure has at least been made to the shareholders.
No, that's not part of
so the shareholders don't know what you're considering paying in bonuses, and they don't know the structure of the bonus scheme that you're going to announce.
Well, as I said, the shareholders know the philosophy, which is pay for performance, and that we don't pay for failure. They know exactly how we're going about the compensation, which is in line with the UK regulations of the FSA, in line with the G20 regulations, and in line with FSB. They know that it's how the governance works. And the most important thing that our owners know, Chairman, is that a strong Barclays is in a strong business, is what they're monitoring most closely. And
how can shareholders exercise judgment and restraint on remuneration if they don't even know the numbers?
I think from what I've said, you know that the shareholders are very involved in terms of our philosophy, about how we determine the pools, about how we run the businesses.
But we've established that they're not going to know the numbers until you've determined what they are at board level. Is that correct?
The board has not determined the pools.
And the shareholders won't be informed until the
no, and they won't be given the disclosure that you were referring to.
Okay, it's Mark Garnier.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Darwin, you come out in the past saying you're very against having a functional separation of the retail and investment banking side of your bank. Wouldn't you not agree, though, that actually having a functional separation would result in greater financial stability in your organisation?
It's a very good question because it's the one that we get asked the most in terms of separation of retail and investment banking. Let me kind of give an overview, and then I'd ask Anthony to make a comment, particularly from the retail banking side of how that works. It's interesting, and I started on this earlier, that the integrated universal banking model gives us far more financial stability because we have deposits, both institutional and customer, from a broader group of clients investors from a broader geographic reach. We have revenue pools that come from around the world. We have funding sources, both equity and debt, that come from around the world. So the financial stability of Barclays is stronger as a result of the integrated universal banking model. And we see that in our funding spreads, our ability to raise money in the market, and that allows us to have greater capacity for lending and to lend at better terms. So we think both from a financial stability point of view, but also from a customer service point of view, it's a positive for Barclays to have the integrated universal banking model.
One of the things that we saw through the course of the crisis was that customers brought their money to Barclays because they had confidence in Barclays to be there through the travails of the crisis. So customers do have confidence in Barclays as an institution.
I mean, that's very reassuring, but the problem is that there are a number of other banks, as already been referred to, that failed with investment banking operations. Now, if I'm talking to my constituents and they're expecting to go along and deposit money with Barclays, they are going to want to make it absolutely certain that you aren't going to have some rogue trader sitting in Canary Wharf or wherever else, who's going to suddenly do something completely ridiculous and blow the bank up, which we've seen happen on a number of occasions, Soc Gen more recently, Barings before. How can you reassure my constituents, and indeed everybody, and the taxpayer, that cannot happen? You obviously ran a very tight ship when you were running Barcap, but other chief executives don't necessarily do that.
Well, let me take a crack again at a couple of things that I think will help you see why we don't feel that way, and Anthony will pick up again as well. If you look at the failures in the United Kingdom, whether it was the Bank of Scotland or a combination of the Bank of Scotland and Halifax, whether it happened before the integration with Lloyds or after, there was no rogue trader, there was no derivative, there was no proprietary trading, it was vanilla lending, it was a lack of risk management, it was an overexposure in some cases to commercial real estate, it was traditional vanilla banking business that created the issues of failure in the United Kingdom. And I think it's unfortunate that people use terms like rogue trader and casino banking when the truth is that at Barclays we exited proprietary trading in 1998. And I couldn't be prouder of the business that we've built at Barclays Capital. The clients are at the very, very center of everything we do. I would love to have an opportunity with members of this committee to come in and spend a day in our operation, starting in the morning with flows of deposits from central banks in Asia, seeing the business that we do with pension funds in the UK and helping them earn returns above the almost zero interest rates we have with risk-free returns. It's a customer-driven business. And when I talk about financial stability, I think the best example I can give you is during this period of incredible crisis, and listen, I'm the first to say this is a difficult environment to manage through. In 2008, Barclays made about £6 billion. And that year, about £4 billion of the $6 billion of earnings came from retail banking, and $2 billion from other activities, including investment banking. Well, if you go, we haven't produced results for 2010, but if you go by the analyst expectations, their expectations are about £6 billion in earnings in 2010, and about £4.5 billion of that coming from Barclays Capital, or investment banking, in a very tough year for retail banking because of provisions around housing, around commercial real estate, and other areas. That balance is tremendous. This is fair to say, but if that balance had been there in the Irish banks, would the situation have been different? So I think the diversification of earnings, but the other thing is, it's not appropriate to talk about casino banking and Barclays Capital. It's not appropriate to talk about rogue trading and Barclays Capital. We do take risk. We take risk on behalf of our clients. We have clients that need to raise capital and manage risks. I had a conversation just yesterday with one of our newest clients, a farmer in Wales. He's just moved his account from one of the other UK banks to us. And one of the reasons was the level that we can lend at, and I can come back to that in a second. But one of the other reasons is we're able to help this farmer hedged the EU subsidies out through 2012. And with so much uncertainty in the world, the need to remove as much financial risk from the price of fertilizer, the EU subsidy, the currency exposure on the EU subsidy, so he could focus on his sheep farming and not have to focus on all the other risks, was something that's very important.
Your chairman, Marcus Agius, has referred to the possibility that if Barclays relocating abroad, if the Independent Banking Commission comes up and says you've got a split, would that be a deal breaker for you? Would you feel you have to move abroad?
Let me be perfectly clear, crystal clear. We took our first deposits in the City of London in 1690. We have 320 years of history in London as the premier financial center in the world. We have absolutely no intention of changing that. We're going to work constructively with the Independent Commission on Banking to show that giving customers choice, the choice of an integrated universal banking model as well as others, and the financial stability, we respect the decisions that they will arrive at. We have a lot of respect for the process the Independent Commission on Banking is going through. They have very, very serious people who are taking their job very seriously, and it has implications on the United Kingdom and the economy in the United Kingdom for many, many years to come.
Let me ask
but
you
our starting position is very, very clear.
So
we're going to be here in the United Kingdom, and this is the place that we want to succeed. It's really important, this question, because...
Can I just ask you, in support of your answer...
Remind me to come back to that.
Could you list why you think England is such a good place to be? I mean, it's having a bit of positive news coming out. You can go through, is it the regulatory regime? Is it the tax system? Is it the fact we speak English? Is it the fact that we're the centre of the world in terms of timescale? What is it, then, that makes England the City of London so terrific? And why would you stay? And if you did ever have to move, or feel you want to move, where would you go that would provide as good an opportunity?
Well, let me go through the advantages. As you had asked, and then try and give some balance to the discussion, because there are some issues out there, and I think it would be disingenuous to say that there are no issues. And then I'll ask Anthony to comment as well. You mentioned the English language is certainly an advantage. The time zone is certainly an advantage, but over time there's been no city in the world that has benefited more or been more supportive of foreign trade and flows of business in and out of the city than London. And so London has become a place that's recognized as very, very good for business. It's very, very good for talent. People have enjoyed living here, but it's been much more about companies feeling that this is good for business, it's good for raising capital, and it's good for attracting talent. There are some issues. I think the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the Business Secretary have been very focused on some of those issues in terms of cutting government spending, reducing the deficit, focusing on debt, and recognizing that we have to pass the mantle for growth, because we are going to have a reduction in some employment areas, particularly as public spending comes down, but we have to hand the mantle of growth to the private sector and to banks. And I think they recognize that there was a period of remorse and apology for banks. I think that period needs to be over. We need our banks willing to take risk, confident, working with the private sector in the UK so that we can create jobs and we can improve the economic growth, and that's very important for the United Kingdom. There are some challenges now in terms of some of the actions that have been taken in terms of super equivalency, in terms of regulation. That's not shaking our position at all. I think we're still working through a lot of these, but it would also be good if we had a bit more clarity and confidence. So, I think the confidence in Barclays is there, but it's not that there aren't challenges.
I think it's important to note that we have 66,000 colleagues in the UK, we have 10 million credit card customers, we have 12 million retail bank customers, we have 1 million SME customers. This is a very big, important business for Barclays and will continue to be so.
Thank you.
Michael Fallon.
Mr. Diamond, what would be the impact on Barclays if the Independent Commission recommended keeping universal banks but insisting on greater geographical subsidiarisation, along the HSBC model?
It's difficult to be in a position to because we respect the Independent Commission on Banking and that they're going to go through, we have had an opportunity to submit written evidence. John Barley and Chris Lucas and I have had a chance to testify. I don't want to prejudge that. We believe that but our view is public record, so I'll repeat our view as opposed to what I think they will rule, if that's okay. Our view is that the integrated universal banking model is the right model. And one of the things it does is it improves our ability to fund.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I understand that. Time is short. What would be the impact, though, if you lost that argument and they recommended subsidiarisation?
There is a form of subsidiarization. The difficulty is the nuance. Subsidiarization is a very broad term. If there was an extreme version of subsidiarization, it would be in essence the same as separating retail and commercial banking.
You don't think the taxpayer interest would be better protected by more subsidiarisation than we have at present?
I don't, and I think, I feel strongly that the model that we employ is best for financial stability. I mean, I can throw out a few questions for you that you have certainly had to wrestle with in the United Kingdom, but, the best example would be Barings. Barings' operation in Singapore was a subsidiary. It was the extreme of subsidiarization, but it didn't prevent taking down Barings. I think last year we saw an example where HSBC had real issues over a couple of years in their portfolio in the U.S. with the acquisition of Household, and certainly we didn't see HSBC walk away from that. So I think we have to be we have to focus much more on what the implications are in terms of funding, and there would be a significant increase in the funding levels for a firm modeled such as Barclays. And that has implications in terms of the capacity for lending as well as the price of lending.
Thank you.
David Ruffley.
Mr. Diamond, the Bank of England have pointed out that because you're too big to fail and because the taxpayer stands behind you, as a result of that you're much more creditworthy and therefore can borrow money much more cheaply than if you were standing alone. They've calculated, the bank, that that's worth £100 billion a year to the big five banks. Are you grateful to the British taxpayer for subsidising you in this way?
There's a couple of answers to this question.
Are you grateful to the British taxpayer?
We are very grateful to
the British taxpayer.
May I answer? We are very grateful to the central banks around the world, to the governments around the world for the actions that they took.
No, I'm talking about the British government, who stand in the shoes of the British public. They say, and this is accepted, that you're too big to fail. And the taxpayer stands behind you. That makes you more creditworthy. It means you can borrow much more cheaply than if you're a standalone organisation. Now, what I'm asking you, Mr. Diamond, is are you grateful to the British public?
Can I ask you one question?
Can you answer that question? I ask the questions, you give the answers.
Okay. But
are you grateful to the British public?
Part of what you said...
Are you grateful to the British public?
We are very grateful to the central banks. We're very grateful to everyone. We're very grateful to everyone that has helped the financial system
the British taxpayer?
Get back. We're thankful for everyone.
But that includes the British taxpayer.
What you just said, sir, is that because of the implied government support...
You're accepting that?
But last week, we raised money at about 50 to 100 basis points lower in yield than the government-guaranteed banks in the UK.
Right. You accept you're receiving a subsidy. Does that mean you feel you have a social responsibility to Britain to lend more so that economic growth can take place?
Listen, absolutely. We think being a responsible banker is important. So if I gave any impression otherwise, I apologize. We need to be responsible. We need to do a better job of explaining to people in the United Kingdom.
Okay, let's cut the generalities. If we're going to actually get something from you for all the taxpayer subsidy we give you, many people, including in my constituency in Bury St Edmunds, small businesses, want banks like you to lend more. What did you lend last year to business in Britain?
And sir,
in general terms, how much did you lend last year?
I completely understand the need for bankers to be responsible.
No, sorry. How much did you lend last year?
In 2008, we increased lending in the UK by £35 billion. Sorry, in 2009, we increased lending in the UK by £35 billion. What we talked about early in the year was setting a target of $11 billion.
Yeah.
We exceeded it substantially. In 2010, we have increased lending in the UK by £35 billion through the first 9 months of the year. So it will be larger on a full year basis.
Right.
We're very committed to lending. I need to point something out, and I think it's really important. Lending is what we do. The United Kingdom is our single most important market. We like to lend. It's our business. It's what we do with our customers and clients. I think, Anthony, you can give many examples.
Well, I don't want to speak to Anthony. I want to speak to Bob on this occasion. Now, in the FT this morning, it suggested that in return for the government going easy on you on bonuses, on not throwing the book at you, that you will be asked to pledge to lend more next year. And the figure suggested floating around is all the big 5 banks lending up to 10% more next year than last year. Now, what figure do you have in your mind? And share it with the committee, because we're asking the questions on behalf of small businesses and the British taxpayer here. How much more are you going to lend next year? You must have a notional figure in your head.
Well,
do you?
We have had discussions with the government. As I have not read the FT article, so I'm not aware.
It was this morning, so it's good read.
We increased our lending by £35 billion in 2009. We did new lending of £35 billion in 2010. Can I have a chance to
going forward? Yeah.
It is important. It's not a simple question. There has
yes,
been
it is a simple question. What are you going to lend next year?
Let Mr. Diamond answer the question.
Well, he's not doing terribly well at the moment. Go ahead.
So, we are committed to increasing lending. The big 4 or 5 UK banks are in discussions. No decisions have been made, but we are committing to increase our lending in the UK. Those are the discussions.
Yeah, okay. Discussions. Can you put a figure on it? With the figure floating around is 10% more for the big 5. Now, what increase in lending next year to help the British economy grow? This is what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of UK PLC. Now, what I want to know is what sort of increase in lending. Don't just say more lending. Next year, you're a highly paid businessman, okay? Share with this committee in general terms what increase percentage in lending next year you're going to contribute to the British economy.
We have not yet made a decision.
You haven't?
No.
Why not? We're into 2011 already, as you probably noticed. This coming year, what are you looking at?
You give me a second to give you an answer?
Well, just give
I'd
me
really
an answer.
appreciate
That'd be nice.
Just a couple minutes, and then I'm happy to take follow-ons. We've seen a withdrawal, to your point, because it's a very good question. We have seen a withdrawal of foreign banks and non-banks from lending in the UK. And over the last couple of years, the UK banks have picked up the capacity that was removed from the UK. We have been very clear that we are committed to lending to our businesses here. Our best business is doing lending with our corporate clients in the UK, small businesses and large businesses. We have seen demand reduce. We have seen our approval rates stay steady or increase at 80 to 85% of small business loans are being approved, which is equal to or slightly better than it was before the crisis. We will continue to focus in this area. We think it's good business, and we want to be a part of the economy growing. But what I would point out is that the best thing that Barclays can do for the UK economy and for UK jobs is to have a strong bank and strong risk management. Barclays has performed very well during 3 years of financial crisis, having made profits in every single reporting period, having increased our lending to customers. I think Anthony and I would say in almost every line of business, we're doing more business with more clients. And it's that strength, as the Chancellor said in his FT editorial last week, weak banks are dragging the economy across Europe, and weak banks are dragging the economy in the UK. Strong banks, working together with the private sector, is what our responsibility is to create jobs and create economic growth.
Okay, but you don't want to
we have an obligation to our owners. We have an obligation to our clients and our customers to do what they want. We have an obligation to 150,000 employees around the world, over 60,000 of them here in the UK.
Yeah.
And we do have an obligation, as you said, and I agree with you. We have an obligation to give back in the communities where our banks are, both by lending and by being better citizens. We agree with that.
Yeah,
We are
it isn't just to shareholders. You have a moral obligation and a social obligation to the British taxpayer that gives you this implied subsidy that I described earlier. Let me just conclude by saying, will you
one
be...
very last quick
It is
question,
the last question.
and a quick reply, if
Okay.
possible, please. Thank you.
Some chance. Will you resign, make yourself accountable by promising to resign now today, if you do not significantly increase lending in the coming year, so that Britain can grow and British economies can borrow on sensible terms?
Well, we can't...
It's a yes or no, because the chairman wants a quick answer to
Well,
this. No?
Just let Mr. Diamond.
One of the things
reply.
I will be sure of, and I'm going to give a full answer, I apologize. You're going to get a full answer, and I think there's some things that we can all learn together. This is an opportunity to learn. This is about choice and competition in banking, and I respect the inquiry. No bank should ever make a specific commitment to how much they're going to lend without looking at the creditworthiness of the borrower. That's how the UK banks, the Bank of Scotland, and a number of other banks got into trouble. We're not making the United Kingdom a better place with weak standards around credit. Having said that, we are a bank. We are a British-based bank. We like to lend to our customers. I talked to a number of our business customers yesterday who are very active in increasing their employment and increasing their business because they have access to lending. So I think there's much more agreement, David, between us. We do feel a responsibility to jobs and economic growth in the UK.
Andrew Ledson.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Diamond, I worked for Barclays and BZW for 10 years, including running the investment banks team when Barings went bust. And I would just like to correct you on that specific point on subsidiarisation, because, in fact, Barings Treasury, the group, was lending limitless sums of money, and that's what made them go bust, to a Singapore subsidiary that was not capitalised at all. So it wasn't really subsidiarisation, it was cock-up. So just on that point, if you'll forgive me for correcting you. But what I'd like to talk to you about is accountability. And it's this really, that having been in banking for a very long time, I completely understand and have authorised and paid very significant bonuses to traders on very specific briefs that they have met. And that to me seems at the core of our sort of capitalist society, wealth creation and so on. But really, it's the accountability that is the question I have. And that is, when you are the board member, whether you're the chief executive or the head of risk or whatever, who authorises the level of leverage that enables those traders to make those profits using extreme levels of leverage that in effect broke our financial system, who should be accountable? How do you think we can hold those senior individuals accountable in the future?
There's a host of ways, and I think it's the right question. I think leverage throughout the banking industry and throughout society was probably at levels that were too high before the crisis, and hopefully it's one of the lessons we've learned. In Barclays, our leverage has gone from about 34 or 35 to 1 down to 20 or 21 to 1. So we have changed the way we've done business. In terms of producers, risk managers or traders, depending on how we refer to it, we have always judged them based on their risk-adjusted returns. So I think the quality of their returns, whether those are completely booked or there's residual tail risk, how much leverage they've used, how much capital they've used, all those things have to come into account. And then, to your point, I think adhering to the G20 and the FSA and the FSB principles in terms of compensation and clawback and deferral, those are all ways that we try and get at the question that you ask.
Okay, but looking specifically at the issue of accountability, there has been no real accountability, has there, for the financial crisis? forgive me, you've said yourself Barclays didn't take taxpayer money, but of course all banks did. It was the central bank's action in the interbank market that saved the banking system from total collapse, including Barclays, even with its strong capital ratios and so on. There's no question about that. You also benefited from taxpayer bailout. But there has been no accountability. Many chief executives didn't take a bonus for a year, but now they're presuming business as usual and they're moving on. Very few people even lost their jobs. There was certainly no bans. Even Sir Fred Goodwin didn't lose his significant pension, now being funded by the taxpayer. So where is the accountability, the individual accountability going to be?
Well, if I start with myself, I take my accountability in we have to be a strong bank that is supporting economic growth and job creation while at the same time recognizing that mistakes were made and that we need a safer and sounder financial system. And we worked on both sides of that. So there are changes in banks. Barclays today carries 10% core equity. It was closer to 5% before the crisis.
Yes, I understand that the bank has changed, but I'm talking about the accountability. I'm talking about, as the chairman was saying at the start, there are no shirts on the line. Nobody's gone to prison. Nobody's nobody's been banned from ever working in a financial services company again. And incidentally, people were in the Barings collapse. People were banned from ever holding a financial services post again. That simply hasn't happened. And what I'd like to know is, what are we to say to our constituents who write to us in rage and absolute frustration that they will lose their jobs, almost certainly their 20 to 30,000 a year jobs, and yet the chief executives who effectively, as far as they're concerned, got us into this mess are carrying on business as usual and about to take home very generous bonuses?
Well, I think that we do understand the mood of some people, and I think there's two answers from that from a Barclays point of view. I think there is a difference between an institution taking direct investment from government and taxpayers and the things that were done by central banks and governments. Chancellor Darling did a tremendous job during the crisis. And let's be honest, that benefited all of us. That benefited governments, that benefited banks, that benefited companies. It was really the financial system, and it was about being the lender of last resort. We are very appreciative of the moves that have been made by everyone that was involved in making sure that we have a global economy and an economy in the UK and an economy in the US. On the other hand, it is true, and I'm just going to say this, that there's 150,000 people at Barclays that are very, very proud that they never failed a stress test, that our risks, while we all made mistakes, and I certainly made mistakes, but we never put the bank at risk or the system at risk.
Okay,
let me finish, please. I think that the fact that we never took a single penny of taxpayer money from any country everywhere in the world, the fact
but
that
that's
we were...
not true, is it? That's not true on that point. Sorry.
I allowed you to ask a complete question. I would appreciate it if you'd allow me to give a complete answer. So it was about how we managed our risk and how we performed on stress tests in the most difficult time. It was about being profitable in every single reporting period. Most importantly, it was about being close to our customers and clients. During the worst of the crisis in 2008, there were days when we had 4 or 5 times increase in the amount of foreign exchange transactions from central banks in the UK and Europe and Asia who had to hedge out risks. So we are very, very proud of how we're performed. That doesn't mean that we're also not extremely grateful for the support that was given by regulators, by central banks, and by governments in terms of monetary and fiscal stimulus. Our obligation, though, and that's what I want to get to, our obligation is to run a great bank. Our obligation is that Barclays has to be part, now that we've had some answers, not complete, on making the financial system safer and sounder. And we have been a very big part of working with the regulators both in the US, in the UK, and Europe on that. Now our obligation is very clear. It's time to pass the mantle to the private sector. That's where growth, that's where the economy, that's where job creation is going to come from. It's not going to come from the private sector, and it should come from the private sector. And so I want my feet held to the fire of, can I operate Barclays in a new environment that's safer and sounder, with higher capital ratios and lower leverage and still serve my clients, whether they're operating in China or in India or in Africa? Can we still serve them in all the things that they need to manage their risks, to invest their pensions, and to raise capital? And that's the best help we can give the United Kingdom, because there is an issue that's being addressed here in terms of high spending, high taxes, high levels of deficits, and we all want to make that situation better over time. And so the best thing we can do is to run a fantastic Barclays.
Okay, one very last quick question. Could you just comment on the structured organisation Proteum and the fact that it, I gather, holds toxic assets of the bank? And could you just comment on whether that's an appropriate, in your opinion, clearly it is, an appropriate thing to be doing with poor assets of the bank, and what the impact will be in terms of separating non-performing assets from the bank's general balance sheet?
Proteum is a transaction that you refer to. We had some illiquid assets that we sold, so Proteum is not a part of Barclays. So we did have some sticky illiquid assets that we sold, and it's something that the regulators and the FSA were aware of. I think all banks came through this period recognizing that, quite frankly, we had some assets on the balance sheet that were less liquid than we had hoped and were more difficult to move.
And is your personal remuneration in any way tied to the performance of that subsidiary?
Well, no, we don't. It's not owned by Barclays.
Okay. Shukramani.
Thank you, Mr. Diamond. Just picking up on the reference to the benefit of stimulus for the sector, you said in your CBI speech in October that you were grateful for the stimulus and that you recognised the benefits and accepted that obligations went with that. Would you say that one of the ways companies meet their obligations to society is through the payment of tax? Yes or no?
I think payment of tax is an important responsibility of businesses, yes.
Could you tell me how many subsidiary companies your group uses and are incorporated in the Isle of Man?
I don't have that number with me. I'd be happy to look into it.
Well, according to the return that your group company put in last year, you have 30 subsidiaries operating in that jurisdiction. Can you tell me how many subsidiary companies you have operating in Jersey?
I don't have that number with me either.
The number is 38. Can you tell me how many subsidiary companies of your group are incorporated and operating in the Cayman Islands?
Same answer.
You have 181. Now, of course, all of these are well-known tax havens which are used by companies, and a cursory reading of your group returns shows that you have over 300 such companies operating in tax haven jurisdictions around the world. Could you confirm that whilst you headed up BarCap, the bank's structured capital markets division sat within BarCap? You, if you like, had oversight of it.
Yes, it did.
So that division runs tax arbitrage for your bank, for high net worth individuals, for companies, which enable you all to avoid the payment of UK tax.
That's not correct.
That's not correct. Why?
Structured capital markets is part of our overall financing operation. It is our obligation when we do financing for clients to do it in the most tax-efficient way. So it's an institutional business. It works within our financing. I'll give you a very good example. When the United Kingdom decided to develop the Canary Wharf area, they created, I forget the exact phrase, but a tax-free zone. And so in order to encourage people to move to Canary Wharf and to build buildings, they did it with tax benefits. One of the things that we have done is we have been at the forefront of leading financing of many of those businesses, of many of those buildings, using the expertise in the area that you talk about with our financing capability. And so we're doing things that are completely in line with government incentives. They want people to move. They want people to go to Canary Wharf. They're using tax incentives to do it. I'd ask AJ to speak as well. It's no different than ISAs.
Okay.
ISAs are a government incentive
so if it's
for
the case
tax-efficient savings.
I don't. Sorry, Mr. Dunn, I don't have that much time, and we want answers and not speeches. But if I just ask you this question, if it wasn't engaged in tax avoidance, why then did your bank injunked The Guardian in March 2009 when they sought to disclose the activities of that division within the bank?
Again, that's not why we did it. I'm happy to explain. The information that The Guardian released had two features to it. One, it was already known to HMRC. They had the documents. We had sent them before the transaction. Our injunction was because someone stole confidential client information, which is against the law.
Okay. Well, obviously the payment of tax by banks in the sector is of great interest to everybody. And
we paid
you've
£2
all
billion
been
in tax we paid £2 billion in tax last year to HMRC. And over the last 6 years, we've paid about £12.5 billion in
of
tax.
that $2
I think
billion,
that's the number
of
that
that
you're looking
$2
for.
billion, what percentage were non-payroll taxes?
I don't have the percentages.
So it could be that most of that is actual payroll tax paid by your employees. But in terms of the corporate tax, we don't really know the figure, do we,
That's
Mr.
the payment
Diamond?
from Barclays to HMRC.
Yes, but of what percentage of that was non-payroll tax?
I haven't got the percentages.
Well, then we don't really know what, as a corporate entity, you're paying. Now, obviously, you are signed up to the new code of practice for tax that the government's put in place, and that requires compliance with the spirit and not just the letter of the law. Will you commit today to reducing the number of offshore companies you are currently using to transact business to demonstrate that you will comply with that code?
Well, we have signed the code. We are complying with both the spirit and the letter of the law, and that was what was asked of us, and we're happy to do it.
So will you commit to reducing your use of offshore companies to transact business?
I'm happy to look into the numbers that you gave. I didn't have them, and it would not be appropriate for me to agree to something that I'm not sure of the facts of. I am happy to look into it and write to you and write to the committee if that's helpful. But it's
because
not
you will understand, Mr. Diamond, that there's obviously, I mean, if you look at the facts I've just presented, that would suggest that your bank is engaged on tax avoidance on a grand scale, would it not?
I can assure you Barclays is not evading taxes.
And if
I can assure you that it is our obligation.
Sorry, that wasn't the question I asked. I said avoidance. I was very careful not to use the word evasion, Mr. Diamond.
Well, I don't know what I think tax evasion is a very clear phrase, and it's a space we would never go to.
And I didn't use the word.
And I chose the word tax efficiency, which is our obligation, and it's something that is in line with government policy.
But your efficiency may be our avoidance. Can I just perhaps finish by asking?
I don't think that's the case.
You don't think that's
I am very, very confident. I'll answer the question directly. I have a high degree of confidence in the integrity, in the governance, and in the people that follow both the spirit and the letter of the law in terms of doing the right things in the space.
And if I could just ask perhaps one last question. One of the things that contributed to the crash, I think is generally acknowledged, is reckless and perhaps risky behaviour in the sector. In some senses, there's a big question mark over your head, Mr. Diamond, because you sought to try and obviously purchase ABN AMRO at the same time that it was purchased by RBS. You may well have ended up being the Fred Goodwin of the crash, and luckily for you that didn't happen. You also sought to try, you pushed very hard to purchase Lehman sometime before it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and you're also a great fan of exchange-traded funds, which are also being questioned a lot at the moment. How do you respond to that, and do you understand why perhaps people don't think you are suitable to be running one of the biggest banking institutions in this country?
I appreciate the opportunity because there's not substance to the accusations. So let me take them in their piece parts. They're very serious questions and they're very serious accusations. So ABN AMRO. I was not the chief executive, but I was on the executive team that proposed that deal. And let's walk through it carefully. In March 2007, we had an agreed deal with the board of ABN AMRO. That deal was going to be paid for in shares of Barclays, not in cash. There was then a hostile bid that broke up our bid by three parties led by Royal Bank of Scotland, who paid in cash, not shares. We paid in shares because if there was a market event and our shares traded down, the price we paid would flex down. RBS chose to have another bank, Santander, come in and take the Italian operations and the Brazilian operations. And I recall John Varley being interviewed saying we would not do a deal without the Italian operations or without the Brazilian operations, and that we would not do a deal in cash, and that we would not raise the price to their level. So we walked away. The Italian bank was sold for 10 billion euros within 2 months, and today the market value of the flotation of the Brazilian operation is greater than the market value of Royal Bank of Scotland. To compare those two deals the way you just did is inappropriate and not based in fact. And it's not appropriate to the reputation of Barclays and Barclays management. In terms of Lehman Brothers, we're in consultation both with our own regulator and with the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve. And what we proposed on the Saturday morning before bankruptcy is that we would be interested in buying, and we would make a proposal under 3 conditions, and this is documented. Condition 1 is that the $60 billion in difficult-to-price, toxic, difficult assets, illiquid assets, the illiquid private equity, and the commercial real estate were taken out of the deal, and that was agreed. The second condition is that we would have a guarantee from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for clearing and funding on Monday morning for as long as it took for us to get a shareholder approval that we could provide that guarantee. And if those 2 things were approved, we would then recommend the deal to the FSA. The first of those 2 was finalized, the exclusion of the $60 billion in toxic assets, illiquid assets, hard-to-fund assets. We did not get a guarantee for funding and clearing. We worked until Sunday morning, and therefore we never proposed a deal to the FSA. But we were very careful of our risks in doing the deal, that we were ring-fencing away from Barclays and away from any UK risk, the assets that were troublesome.
But didn't you say
so
to
I think
a court,
that's a much different perspective on each of those 2 transactions.
just in relation to the second of those, didn't you say to a court over the summer in New York that frankly you didn't actually know what you were buying when you got Lehman? You said there were huge gaps and misinformation.
Well, if you take the complete testimony that I made, because of that, we priced them accordingly. So there were many assets, if we couldn't tell what was there, we would price them at 0. So we didn't take risk for our shareholders or risk for the UK in doing it. It was why the pricing of Lehman Brothers ultimately was as, reflected the volatility in the market. There were other assets that we took where we did know the market price and felt that there was liquidity that we could transact at those prices.
Thank you.
Thank you for those full answers. Stuart Hosey.
Thank you. Mr. Diamond, the bank needs to look after the interests and benefit shareholders, its staff and customers. How would you prioritise these 3 groups?
Shareholders, staff, and customers, I don't know how I could prioritize them other than saying they're all number 1.
They're all number 1. Okay. But shareholders have seen the dividend go down from 34 pence a share in 2007, 2.5 pence in 2009, and you paid out 3 pence only in 2010. A peak-to-trough fall of 90%. What's happened to staff remuneration over that period?
I haven't got I certainly don't have the figures, but we don't relate directly staff remuneration. As I said earlier, the remuneration of staff is a function of paying for those people that perform, not the people that fail. It's in line with the G20 principles and the FSA principles. It has governance from our board, and the objective is to have the best businesses that we can have.
I'm sure
in terms of dividends, it's a difficult environment for dividends, as shareholders know, because the regulators would prefer that most financial institutions would build their reserves and build capital. So it has been difficult for investors who are relying on dividends.
I understand the need to back the balance sheet. I understand the capital requirements. Let me tell you what you did in terms of total staff costs. In 2007, you paid 8.4 billion, 7.2 billion in 2008, 9.95 billion in 2009, and it's pretty likely the figure won't be much different from that for 2010. It was reported also by the Telegraph in December, you're backdating salary increases and you've more than doubled the basic salary cap. It strikes me that the shareholders are coming off very poorly here as the staff continue to be rewarded in large measure by bonuses. Why are the shareholders being treated like this?
I think we have to continually come back to compensation. And listen, I understand there's, there's a lot of debate in the area of bonuses. There's a lot of sensitivity. And I am committed as chief executive to being responsible and to providing any restraint I can. I can assure this committee that bonuses aren't taken lightly and that we pay what is appropriate to pay for the reasons I went through and to have the best business that Barclays can have. I wish I could isolate bonuses and say, I'm going to have a really good Barclays Capital and I'm going to have a really good Barclays Retail Bank, but I'm just going to decide at the end of the year not to pay anyone. But it's not that simple. This is a business where all these pieces integrate together. We had a mention of BZW earlier. Up until 1996, the investment bank from Big Bang in 1986 till 1996, the investment bank of Barclays was BZW. I'll be frank, it didn't pay very big bonuses. But also be frank, it never earned its cost of equity. It was a business that had a weak client base, a weak international position, and very weak, and had a lot of pushback from shareholders who said, we really don't want you to be in that business. I am so proud of Barclays Capital. It's the only investment bank, global investment bank, that's been successful, that's been built from scratch. In 1997, we began building that business, and today it's in the top 3 in the world in fixed income. It's in the top 3 in the world in commodities. It's in the top 3 in the world in raising funds for corporates. It's in the top 3 of the world in debt capital markets. It's growing. It had an absolutely fantastic deal with Lehman Brothers to make it an even stronger organization. It's client-based. It's client-focused. It deals with the pension funds in the UK. It has been profitable every year since 1998. It's been at the top of the table in terms of returns on capital, returns on equity, and a lot of the investors in Barclays are investors in Barclays today because of the success of Barclays
right.
Capital.
Mr. Diamond,
I couldn't. If I will wind it down. I apologize. I know it's long, but I'll try and finish. We could not. This team could not have built Barclays Capital if we couldn't commit to our people that we're going to pay for performance, not failure. That we're going to do it in line with the competitors. Barclays Capital doesn't compete with Lloyd's or Northern Rock. It competes with J.P. Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs.
I understand
and so we can't isolate bonuses and say, let's leave everything else in the business the same.
I understand.
But just take out bonuses.
And I've allowed you to speak
thank you for that. I apologize.
About Barclays Capital, and you're obviously very proud of it. But the fact remains, it's the shareholders who own this. And is it not the case that in terms of Barclays as a whole, the bonus pot will be bigger than the shareholder dividend? Is that not the case?
I can only answer it the way I answered it before, which is that there's not a direct relation between those.
Well, let me ask another question.
Our shareholders are very supportive of Barclays Capital as a business and the returns it's given them.
I'm sure they are, but if you don't have that information to hand...
But if you're sure there are, then you would understand why we can't isolate one piece of how we run the business.
I understand your universal integrated model perfectly well. I'm simply trying to understand why the shareholders are receiving a 90% reduction in their returns while the bonus pots have remained rather significant. Can I ask you, do you decide on the bonus pools before the dividend?
The dividend is decided during the year, quarter by quarter and half by half. So it's actually, I would say, the other way around.
So,
but it's not quite fair to say that because bonuses are kind of managed and accrued during the year. So you have some line of sight. I think it would be fair to say that they're both managed in a similar time frame.
Right, okay. Do you think the balance between the bonus and the shareholder dividend is right?
I don't think there's a direct relation between the two, but let me answer it a different way. I think, and I'll ask Anthony to speak as well, if you're asking us, are we happy with our share price, we think there's a lot more work to do to get the share price up.
Well, let me just finish on the share price issue, because that's very interesting. The late Sir Brian Pittman told the Future of Banking Commission the bankers should be rewarded for generating long-term sustainable increase in shareholder value. So do you agree with that, and what length of period do you consider to be long-term?
I think that there's many measures that we should be held to. And I think there was a period of time when TSR, total shareholder return, was held as the best judge of management performance. And I think we would say that that's probably doesn't have as much acceptance with our owners and shareholders today as it might have years ago. So we're shifting and going to shareholders this year on more of a balanced scorecard where it's return on risk-weighted assets, return on equity, risk management in terms of loan losses, and most importantly, corporate and social responsibility.
And does that cover up an embarrassment that the share price, which was at 548.75 pence in 2001, was sitting at only 272 pence in the 5th of January this year?
If you're asking Anthony and I, do we have a job to do to continue to increase the share price? We do. It's a high focus of ours, and we should be held accountable.
Can I just add one final question, just on this bonus? Very, very quick.
Sorry.
You said
Apologies.
that you don't take bonuses lightly. You said that bonuses are not taken lightly. Do you understand how toxic this issue is in the real world? When people can't get mortgages, when businesses can't get credit lines, when they hear about 7 or 8 billion bonus pools across the banking sector, do you understand how toxic this is in the real world?
We are sensitive, we are listening, and I think one of the reasons I was looking forward to today was to have an opportunity to try and put some balance and some understanding. I think one of the things that I have to hold myself accountable for, and as an industry, is I think we've done a very poor job over the years of explaining how the compensation process is integrated with all the other aspects as I talked about. We've done a poor job of explaining how investment banks in particular contribute to society and contribute to our clients, and I certainly pledge to do more in that regard. I am very, very proud of our 150,000 employees around the world and how they performed in 3 very, very difficult years. The reason I'm most proud of them is how they've increased their client business and client service, and I'm sure you'd like to say a few words. But that doesn't mean for a second that we've gotten everything right. I've certainly made mistakes. I think banks have learned during this process. I think we've had positive changes in the regulatory environment, but there's no lack of effort on our part to recognize and be responsible in terms of being sensitive to this issue.
Before passing over questioning to John Mann, could I just clarify one thing? In response to questions from Shukra Rahman, did you agree that you will provide us with a breakdown of corporate tax paid versus payroll tax?
I didn't, but I'm sure that we can do that. And what I was committing to also is I wasn't familiar with the numbers you had.
And you're going to come back on
I'll
that
come back
as well.
on that, yes, sir.
Would you also at the same time come back on what you consider to be your fiduciary duty with respect to maximising tax efficiency? You don't need to answer that now, but that seems to be a relevant question in that area of cross-examination that was not covered.
Well, we have signed, I forget the phraseology, I think it's a business practices code or the
yeah. Well, come back to us in writing on it. John Mann.
Mr. Diamond, on how many occasions have the Prime Minister and Chancellor met with you personally, looked you in the eye and asked you to show restraint in the size of your bonus?
They have not.
They have not. Can I ask you a philosophical question? Why is it easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven?
Do you have another question?
I have another question if you can't answer that one. You'll have heard of the banking term moral hazard. Have you heard of the new banking term moral haze?
I have not.
No. What moral haze is Barclays Bank freezing the accounts of its Jewish customers during the Second World War. It's Barclays Bank in the 80s trying to pay for anti-apartheid activists to go to South Africa in order to whitewash the apartheid regime. moral haze is not just about paying excessive salaries and bonuses when you help to create the crisis, but then shrouding them in secrecy. It's the use of backdating. It's the use of independent offshore companies and the loaning of money to such companies to buy toxic assets. It's the use of supplementary salaries. I mean, my question to you, Mr. Diamond, is why are you worth all the money that you're paid?
That was I wouldn't know where to begin. You threw an awful lot of accusations out there. I think you ended with a question that all I can say on my own remuneration is that's a decision that the board takes, I don't take.
Well, I threw in a lot of facts, not accusations, facts.
Not sure of that.
You're not sure? Well, they're facts.
Okay.
Recorded, known facts. You gambled and you won. Somebody had to win. Somebody had to lose. And the rest of us lost. Some banks lost, but the taxpayer lost. People who are losing services or losing jobs in this country across the world lost. But you were partly responsible, weren't you? I mean, you tried to back the question of your role with, for example, ABN AMRO. But you were part of the bidding war. You were part of the cheerleading, in the middle of it, but the media cheerleading alongside in order to try and expand the size of your bank. And you were up against someone who was even more reckless than you. That's the facts, isn't it? You were part of the problem that we all now have. Isn't that the case?
No, we don't think so. I think, I understand you're coming at it from a different direction, but we felt our obligation was to our owners. Our obligation was to our customers and our clients and our employees, our regulators, and we had complete transparency with all of them on our ambitions for ABN AMRO. And we felt a number of things, but in particular, an opportunity to invest in an outstanding retail bank in Brazil and expand our retail banking operations, which are in Portugal, Spain, a little bit in Italy, with the Italian operations, were very positive for our owners and our shareholders, good for our clients and customers and employees. So,
but we had RBS here, and we questioned them, and you and them were after the same thing. I mean, you said at 11:03 today that it was your duty to show any restraint that I can. So will you agree to take no bonus this year?
I haven't been offered a bonus, and that's a decision that the Remuneration Committee will be taking over the next few weeks.
Of course it will. But what you stated at 11:03 is that it was your role to show any restraint I can. So I repeat the question. If offered a bonus this year, will you agree to take no bonus this year?
Last year, I made a decision to waive my bonus. The year before that, as you know, I made a decision to take no bonus. At this time last year, I had not been awarded a bonus. And today, I have not been awarded a bonus.
So will you?
The process has not taken place yet.
Well, of course it hasn't.
That's a long-winded answer.
But if you're offered one, will you agree this year to forsake it? As you say, your role, to quote yourself, is to show any restraint I can.
I think the best answer I can give you is to go back to how the process works. And if I was going to make a personal decision, I'd make that decision with my family, as I did last year.
I mean, some people would like to know why, after the sanctions busting of Barclays with Iran, with Sudan, Burma and others, there aren't Barclays executives in prison. But I want to know whether there are any supplementary salaries being paid by Barclays to try and mask the overall pay and remuneration of your top people.
You're not a big fan of Barclays, are you?
I'm a big fan of getting answers from you.
What question would you like an answer to? There's no secret compensation. I've been through the governance structure. The shareholders ultimately approved the remuneration report. We have an independent board remuneration committee that decides all compensation matters. To be quite honest, I've been through the governance and the process and the adherence with the principles of the G20 and the FSA. My obligation is to run the best business I can run for the benefit of our owners and shareholders, but also for the benefit of society. And frankly, the biggest issue for Anthony and I is how do we work, how do we put some of the blame game behind us? There's been apologies and remorse from bankers. Today, how do we get banks and the private sector? We have over £1 billion of cash sitting on the balance sheets of UK corporates. They don't have the confidence in the economy. They don't have the confidence in banks are back and confident, willing to take risk. We need a dose of confidence. We need to think about what's best for the economy in the UK, and what's best for job creation.
Can I take that from your answer that you're assuring us there is no use of backdating, there's going to be this year no setting up of independent offshore companies, and there's going to be no supplementary salaries paid by Barclays?
Our governance is very strong, and I don't know...
Whether it's transparent is the question.
I'm having a hard time following the question. I apologize. There's no secret compensation arrangements, I can assure that, yes.
And
there haven't been in the past.
Well, let me finally ask you the question I asked before. Why is it easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven?
I'm still stuck on that one.
Well, we call it business ethics.
People have been stuck on that for 2,000 years. And you did provoke it, though, by starting in 1690, and you do expect the committee to move back a bit further than that if you get onto historical analogies. Can we have John Thursday, please?
Thank you. Can we look at bonuses, but not in relation to either you personally or actually to Barclays, but just to be a little theological about it all? Because there's this big number of 7 billion as being a pot that's out there, and there's a sort of civil war that's been going on between government and banking and between politics and banking, which is probably not terribly useful to either politics or banking. So I'd just like to try and get to understand what the bonuses are and why they're necessary in banking. So who gets bonus and why?
We step back from that for a second, and no matter what role you have in Barclays, 150,000 people, whether you're entering orders from clients in Glasgow, if you're working at in Bangalore in one of our service operations, if you're a trader on the gilt desk in the UK, our objective is to evaluate and put people in that role who are the best possible people for that job in that location at that compensation level. So when we're hiring those people, we're always looking what's the appropriate compensation for those people in that job, in that country, in that role. And whether it's in operations that Anthony runs in Africa or India, or whether it's in operations here, that's our starting position. And I think where a lot of the noise is in investment banking, where some of those positions have higher benchmark compensation. And as I said, we look in building Barclays Capital, we never had an objective of paying more than was necessary to pay to do the business.
Can I ask you, as part of that answer, to say why it is that bankers need so much performance-related pay? Because if you do an analysis of senior executives in many other companies, the amount that is paid as salary to just do the job because you're a competent professional, and the amount that's paid for doing particularly well and achieving targets is much more weighted towards the salary. Whereas if you look at banking, the salaries are smaller and the bonuses are much, much bigger. Why is it that bankers, not surgeons or soldiers or manufacturers or anybody else, need to have so much performance-related remuneration in order to do their job?
I might make one point. In the retail bank, which I'm responsible, we employ about 35,000 people in the United Kingdom. The median salary for those people is about £25,000, in other words, about the average. And the bonus component would be between £1,000 to £2,000. So for the vast majority of our colleagues within Barclays, it is exactly as you've articulated. And the philosophy of compensation at Barclays, as Bob has said, is very much to pay for performance. And we use that £1,000 to £2,000 to incent our colleagues to go above and beyond in the course of the year.
Let me ask you, how much, I don't want to ask you specifically about Barclays, and we have this number of 7 billion, it might be 6 or whatever, but how much of that big pot is going to the people you describe? Because obviously if you have a great many small amounts, you can get to a big number. And how much of that big pot is going to the guys who get the telephone numbers that everybody reads about in the headlines?
Well, there's a rough guide. About 10%, between 8 and 10% of our total employment costs in the retail bank around the world goes in what would commonly be referred to as bonuses. That's for the retail bank. And the retail bank around the world is about half the total employee base of the Barclays Group.
I understand that, and I've also looked at the numbers of all the banks, and roughly remuneration varies between about 35 and 45%, but that includes the bonuses. But my question was not actually that. My question was, how much of those how much of the total pot goes to those kind of people? I mean, say it's 7 for the sake of argument. Is £5 billion being paid out in £1,000 bits to lots of hundreds of thousands of employees around the world, and 2 billion going to people who get very big amounts, or what's roughly the relationship? I mean, the point about this being that if we're all screaming at you for 7 billion, and actually it's made up of lots of small amounts to lots of deserving people, then maybe we need to rethink. But if actually it's 10% are going to those people, and 90% are going to 100 people, then maybe you need to rethink.
No, I understand the question, and the visibility that I have is into the businesses that I'm responsible for. I don't have the same detailed visibility as you would understand into other parts of the group. I think it would be fair to say, though, that our piece of the total compensation bonus pool would be relatively smaller than that of Barclays Capital for obvious reasons. The point that I did want to make, though,
perhaps
is...
you can give us a rough percentage.
Yeah. Can you do that for us, please?
I think to your point, the majority of what is often described in the industry of the pool is in investment banking. I think that's what you're asking for. Yeah.
So I mean, it would probably be...
I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but it's the majority.
Probably more than half.
Yes.
Perhaps you could provide it. We recognise the competitive aspects to this for you as a firm, so you can put a rough figure.
I think I can give you a rough breakdown, yes, without compromising the competitive nature.
So the question I come back to is why do bankers in that area of investment banking need so much of their remuneration? I mean, supposing they were getting 2 million a year, will they work harder for 4 or less hard for 1.5? Or are they actually competent, keen professionals like you who probably wouldn't work any harder or any less harder whether you doubled it or whatever? I mean, I'm trying to understand why it's necessary.
Well, there's questions we ask all the time, and that's why we benchmark all the time. And as I said, most of the higher paid people have no guarantee in terms of their compensation. So to your earlier question, which is why is it smaller salary and higher incentive, it is so that we can be flexible based on performance. And I think the situation we face is that in order to build a business like Barclays Capital, in areas like equity capital markets, we're competing with Goldman Sachs, with Deutsche Bank, with JP Morgan. And so one of the things that our remuneration committee stays very close to, and we have outside consultants that help provide it directly to them, is to benchmark both the performance and the compensation. So one of the tough questions, and I said this earlier, is you can't just isolate compensation and assume that all the other performance is there. The other option is that we don't have investment banks located in the UK. And I don't know how that makes the system safer or sounder if we have firms from the U.S. flying in, doing their business here, and then going back to the U.S. or going back to Germany. And I do believe that having a UK-based investment bank in Barclays Capital competing for the best talent in the world and doing business with our UK companies and our UK corporates and being located here is an advantage to the UK. It's not a disadvantage. I don't know how the system would be better if these people were just located offshore.
What we're getting to the heart of is actually you at Barclays and actually no other bank can get off the bonus treadmill. Because if you wish to exist, and if you wish to exist in the UK, you will be competing with all the people you've named throughout the world. And because that is the system, and actually it's not about money, it's just about measuring how good they are. It's just a way of getting more brownie points almost. If you want the top guys, the guys who measure themselves, whether it's in Learjet options or in whatever it is, you're going to have to pay for them. And if you want to be here, you'll have to pay them here. So actually the question is much more of a one for society, which is actually do we want that? And if we don't want it, then we have to give up merchant banking, investment banking in the UK. And that's the choice that you're really is before us.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Would you feel the same way if it was a US-based firm with people located here, as it is a UK-based institution with people located here and in New York? So many of our high-paid people in Barclays Capital don't reside in the United Kingdom and don't do business here. They're in the U.S., or they could be in Japan, or they could be in China. The benefit to the United Kingdom of having Barclays Capital is all the benefits that come from having us located here because we are doing business in China. And that works in a couple of ways, John. That works with our UK corporates. If you look at the FTSE 250, over half of the revenue of the FTSE 250 companies comes from outside of Britain. And we're able to work with our closest clients because we are the #1 investment bank for that UK client base. And when they're doing business in China and in India, Tesco is a good example. Almost all of their job growth and almost all of their investment has been in China and in India, or a large portion of it. I shouldn't say all of it. That's an overstatement. I apologize. But equally, and this is a very important thing, traditionally, everyone here would have thought, if I said, where are the 500 biggest companies in the world located? We kind of think, okay, US, UK, maybe a few European countries. And that's been true. 5 years ago, only 8% of the top 500 companies in the world were located in Asia. Today, it's almost 25%. And by 2015, it's going to be a third to 40% of the 500 biggest companies. Some of those are UK and US companies relocating, but many of them today are the SMEs or small businesses in China or in India that are growing. And I think in the UK we want a bank that has the capacity to service those people, as well as service a farmer in Wales and a small business, because the farmer in Wales needs access to the kind of things that we can do, the skill set that we have because of those operations. So I do think that this is ultimately a decision of why would the United Kingdom not be proud to have one of the world's best investment banks located here? But there is an option to say we only want foreign investment banks doing business with our UK customers.
At the end of the day, the point for policymakers is it isn't a plain vanilla choice of we will have jolly good merchant banks, but we won't pay them bonuses.
Right.
We've either got to accept your bonus culture because we can't change it, or we end up without the banks. That is the actual nub of the question.
And accept that it's competitive, it's benchmarked, there's good governance, and there's good management, there's clawback, all the things that we've talked about we can do, the FSA principles, and I think it's a... But I think you got to the heart of the question, yes.
George Moody.
Can I just put it to you a different way, less friendly, but not unfriendly, but less more blunt than John? A teacher or a nurse or even a surgeon listening to this conversation would wonder why you kind of motivate people other than paying them huge bonuses. And I'd like to put it in a way, you're into football. So Alex Ferguson, Fergie said last weekend, he said, he was playing hell about agents. And he said, you know what one of them tried to do? We went to sign this striker. We paid him the usual Premier League, offered him the usual Premier League price wage for a good striker. And his agent said, I want a bonus for every goal he scores. And Fergie says to the directors, what the hell are you thinking about? Why did we pay that money for him, and why are we paying that salary? We expect him to score goals. Now, that teacher, that nurse, is baffled by this, because if you offered them £1 million and said go through that wall, they'd go through the wall. They're going through the wall now for pittance. Why do you have to pay these obscene bonuses to these self-styled masters of the universe to do a job when you're paying them a very, very decent remuneration in the first place? Are you lacking something, Mr. Diamond, in terms of motivation, that you cannot pay someone 2 or 3 million and expect them to deliver for 2 or 3 million?
George, it's a question I've been asked before, and I think, if I can also say this, I think I myself have recognized with more, now becoming chief executive, that the number of references to me as an American investment banker. I think it's become one word now, not 3 words, American investment banker. And so you should know who I am, because I'm very, very different than that, and I understand what you're saying. I grew up in a small town in western Massachusetts. My great-grandparents on both sides of my family emigrated from Ireland to Massachusetts. I was the oldest son of 9 children. My mom and dad were both school teachers in the local community at the local schools. I learned at a very early age, earlier than I would like to admit, that if I want a new shirt or a football or a bicycle, that I'm going to have to pay for it myself. When I had an opportunity to go to a private college, I was the first member of many generations to do it.
Well, this is very nice, but it's not
way
getting to the point, is it?
Well,
so you've got tears coming down my cheek. With my Irish-Scottish background, oh, it's wonderful. I can hear the bloody bagpipes going. But how
so
does it...
I understand the benefits that I have had in terms of career opportunities. I understand the benefits that people have had in terms of financial rewards. But I'm going to come back to the point, and it was a point that's been brought up a number of times. One can't just isolate bonuses and say we're going to have all the other benefits of business, but just exclude those, because in certain businesses we're dealing with a global talent pool.
Yeah,
and it is benchmarked. And what we can do is we can have good governance. Well, I'm trying to get to the answer, Chairman, which is it's benchmarked about...
Just to be very clear, George's question is, why, almost uniquely, does this industry require such huge bonuses?
I don't think it's uniquely this industry, but I think that doesn't matter. I think the question is, why does this industry? And I think it's the market and performance are what determine it in certain roles and certain jobs in the industry.
Okay, I think that's probably what the best we'll get. But I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And you said you were sensitive, you're listening, you understand. We're going to go through the worst year we've had for decades. Hundreds of thousands of people are getting the redundancy notices as we speak. The public sector are cutting, the health services cutting. People are going to get very, very angry. Yep. And the lack of transparency and straightforwardness by the banks, who your own chairman accepted, played a very great part in landing us where we are. It's going to get if you've had a tough year and you think you've had some criticism, when ordinary people are on the street losing their houses, can't look after their kids, you're going to get worse. And I can't understand why you are simply not more upfront in terms of the information. I mean, when you were asked about bonuses and income levels, you said it's nothing to do with regulators, it's nothing to do with government, it's a market and it's a matter for the shareholders. Now the chairman took you through it. You'll tell the shareholders everything except the level of remuneration for the bonuses are going to give to people. You'll tell them after you've given them. Now, just, Bob, put it in straightforward terms. If I were one of your shareholders, big institutional one, mark you, because you'd pay attention to me rather than if I own some shares, but I own the business, and I trust you, and I've appointed you. But I still like to scrutinise what on earth is going on. Now, specifically, shareholders on what you've said today cannot scrutinise pay below board level. They cannot also have information on pay levels and structures of any staff earning more than the members of the board. Do you think that's a way to treat the owners of the firm?
George, I would treat a small shareholder the same as a large institution. I certainly would for you, and we are sensitive to the issues you raise. And it is going to be a tough environment with, any way you look at it, it's likely to be reduced employment in the public sector. And we support the moves and honestly believe that the best thing we can do is to run this bank so well and to work so closely with our customers and clients that we're doing everything we can to help shift.
No, but what about your owners? Why, if I were a big institution, the ABI have said it, on behalf of their members, they want this information. And you're saying to the owners of the firm, none of your business, I'll tell you when you read it in the papers.
We're not saying
now, that's not acceptable.
We're not saying that. And
but
what we are
saying
is our owners and our shareholders approve our remuneration report and are very supportive of us running the business the way we are.
Where is the level of individual bonuses for the investment side? Where is it in your... I've gone through your remuneration report. It's not there. It's not there. It doesn't tell you anything about the levels of bonuses you're going to give to individual people. How many people are earning more than £1 million? Who's the highest earner in the firm? It's not you, surprisingly, but it's not you. So who is it? How many millionaires have you got on your books? Now, that's straightforward questions I, as an owner, would say, well, I'd like to know. Is that not reasonable? Now, can I just ask you something? Just to, you see, you might think I've been a bit hard with you, and I haven't. But you've had the opportunity, and Walker's put it on the table, and I accept a bit of the argument about competition and competitors, etc. I accept part of that. But is there any middle ground between your present position, which is, I'm not telling you, and Walker saying put them in bands of specific? It seems to me, as an old negotiator, that there's a hell of a lot of space between you and Walker, and it would be very well received, and you would be leading if you started to put some proposals on that said, yeah, we'll give you a bit more transparency.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I think, as Sir David said, the proposals that he made on banded disclosure, which I think you're referring to, would not be appropriate to be done in isolation without the European banks and the American banks.
Oh, no, I have that, but that's... I've just put a position to you. You're in Britain leading one of the leading banks. There's going to be hell on the streets in the months we've got. And for you to actually say, yeah, I understand, never mind Europe, I can live with this sort of transparency. At the moment, there is no transparency. No transparency. And your position up to date, speaking to the chairman, first questions was, and there's not going to be. Now, I don't think that's a sensitive listening approach, especially when there's a fair bit of ground that you can move on without damaging your business.
Well, I hear you, and I do think that we'll find consistency across the G20 in Europe over time, but I suspect it won't be this year, and we have made a decision for commercial and competitive reasons that we didn't want to act alone, but I certainly hear you. And
Well, you cannot. The great advice of anybody on this committee: don't wait for Europe. Do it yourself.
Yeah.
Look, you said that you were led by your customers. Customer I run a customer-sensitive bank. Now, this is no attack on you. You're supposed to be here answering questions on competition and choice in retail banking. We've got there at last.
Bring that up.
We've got there at last. Yeah, we'll get there. Which suggested that, and in fact, I've got the wrong piece of paper, which suggested that when they asked your customers, 53 of them just declared themselves satisfied with the service they got. Current accounts. Direct and Virgin, this is you, Anthony, Direct and Virgin got 88%. Then we moved to, would you recommend this bank to a friend? Minus 35 was your score. Now, some of the other banks didn't come out so well either, so I'm not having a go at Barclays. But is that not just an indication of the lack of competition, the lack of being able to switch, publicity about switching, publicity about charges, etc., that you can treat your customers and still retain them?
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be asked a question at this point. Firstly, let me say that the data that you're referring to from which does not agree with our own surveys. So our own surveys would suggest that about 90% of customers would say they're...
Anthony, when I was in local government, every survey we did said we were perfect, and I learned very early on not to pay any attention to your own surveys. But there
well,
you are.
the surveys that I'm referring to are actually conducted by an independent third party. But
so was ours.
Could I
paid them, though.
But let me answer your question.
Yeah, sorry.
So, about 90% of our customers would say they're very satisfied, or somewhat satisfied. 5% of our customers would say they're dissatisfied. About 80% of customers would recommend us to a friend or colleague. However, let me say that firstly, I believe that the basis of competition in UK banking, UK retail banking, the purpose of this inquiry, is intensifying around both service and product provision. Competition is clearly there around price, and it is our intention in Barclays to continue to improve the level of satisfaction that our customers have with what we do, because we know that that's a competitive advantage, and ultimately that's good for our customers, but it's also good for our shareholders and our colleagues.
Andy Love.
I want to come on to Project Merlin for a moment, but let me refer back to a question that Mr. Ruffley asked earlier on about the Banking Commission. Would I be correct in interpreting what you said to the committee as saying that regardless of the recommendations of the Banking Commission, or indeed any legislation that might follow, Barclays headquarters will remain in London?
I think what I'm saying is that's our intention. One can never make a guarantee because you never know what's going on. But I think if there was any concern on this committee, or that our intention was to move out of the UK, that's certainly not our intention.
So all those media reports are inaccurate.
That's what I'm saying. But I'm not giving an ironclad guarantee. One never can on something like that because you don't know what's happening. But I want you to rest assured that this is the place that we want to be.
How do you respond to the unanimous, I may say, headlines in today's newspapers? I'll choose one to quote from, but they're all pretty similar. Ministers cave in to city over bank bonuses. Is that a recognition that the government has no role in this area?
I think there is, whether we like it or not, there is a role for government in the banks that have a significant shareholding by the government. It's their right, since they have that. I think in terms of governance and all the things that I talked about, there's a role for government. But I think, we should be running our businesses in the best interest of our owners, of our clients and customers, of our employees, also our regulators who are a part of the government here. So I think it's a balance of all those things, yes.
That's going to place an additional responsibility on Merlin, these meetings that are taking place, but I'll come back to that. Mr. Thursdale mentioned earlier on that it's likely, the speculation is that the overall level of bonuses will be about 7 billion, which is slightly less than last year because of market conditions. The government, or through the Prime Minister, has been asking for further restraint. Barclays, it's estimated £2.5 billion. It's suggested that your bonus might be somewhere in the region of £7 to £8 billion. Now, you've just taken over as the Chief Executive. What leadership are you going to show in exercising restraint in all of those areas?
I think most of the numbers that you're referring to are speculation of the press as opposed to anything that we've reported. As I said, we begin, the businesses will meet with the Remuneration Committee of the Board over the next couple of weeks to determine first the allocation of remuneration in general, and then the allocation to individuals.
I understand that. You said that earlier on. What I'm asking you is, you're now no longer the Chief Executive of Barcap, you're the Chief Executive of Barclays PLC. That puts you in a leadership role. You have to exercise leadership. What leadership are you giving in relation to the request made through Merlin that banks exercise restraint in terms of the bonuses that they'll pay this year?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think, as you know, there's a public record of compensation arrangements for the time that I'm Chief Executive going forward that's on public record, and I think in line with what would be expected for that role. Both Anthony and I have also said that we recognize the need to be responsible and show restraint. We have no intention of paying more in bonuses than is necessary to balance all the things. And you know, to all of you, we're reaching out to say we recognize the importance of a safe and sound financial system, but also the importance of jobs and economic growth. And we can't isolate bonuses completely and pretend that actions on that would have no consequences on the rest of the business. We have to balance these things. And we're going to make decisions that we believe will be in the best interests of the United Kingdom.
I mean, if I may say so, there are lots of reports going round that the view that's been taken in the city is that the time for gestures has passed. Gestures meaning what happened to bonuses in the last 2 years. You're signalling nothing today that real restraint will be exercised. Are you going to give leadership in relation to this? You are the Chief Executive of one of the 4 or 5 biggest banks here in the city. It is incumbent upon you, if you so choose, to exercise restraint, and I would ask you to tell this committee in which ways you will give a leadership in exercising that restraint.
I think I've answered the question very directly, and I'll do it again. I think we have to balance the responsibility we have and the recognition of the environment we operate in. I think we have to recognize that the system needs to be safer and sounder in terms of how compensation works. But I also think it's in the best interest of everyone in this country that we shift the mantle of growth to the private sector, and that banks in the private sector have confidence, work together, willing to take risk. And I don't agree, sir, that I can isolate bonuses and assume that they have no, in actions on those, have no consequences on the rest of the business. I have to balance it. That's my job as Chief Executive.
Well, let me come to Project Merlin. This is these meetings that have been taking place between the Chief Executives of large banks and financial institutions and government. Your predecessor was very prominent in a lead role in relation to that. Do you intend to continue playing, for Barclays to continue to play that lead role? And what discussions, I was rather surprised to hear in an answer earlier to Mr. Mann that you haven't had any meetings with either the Chancellor or the Prime Minister in relation to Merlin or what it's choosing to do. What role are you going to play in Merlin?
I apologize if I answered the wrong question. I thought the question was directly about my compensation and had I had meetings on Merlin. I'm very involved, but as you mentioned, John Barley has taken the lead in those discussions, and there certainly have been discussions between John and other banks and both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. I will say that this was all secret, so no one knows about it, or private, I should say, but it's certainly been in the paper, so I don't want to avoid having the discussion. I'm pleased to say that John, although he's handed over the reins as Chief Executive, has agreed to stay on working with both me in my role as Chief Executive and the board around issues just such as this, and is still very active with my total support and our board's total support in the spirit of trying to get an agreement on Merlin. So yes, sir, we do hope to continue in that regard. I'm operating through John, but I don't mean that in any way to mean I'm uninvolved. It's just wonderful to have John, who's taken a leadership role here, to stay with the bank, to help us both with the Independent Commission on Banking and the information that they may need over the next few months.
Can I say that I respond to your answer with some dismay. I would have thought if Merlin was to be given the high priority that Barclays has given it up to now, this is no comment on Mr. Valley. I know that he continues in a role within Barclays, but it really needs the future, the current Chief Executive Officer, to be totally engaged in that process. It really comes as a surprise that you're not, and I would ask you again, are you intending to give a lead in relation to Merlin and in relation to not only bank bonuses, but Mr. Ruffley earlier on asked about finance for small businesses, which is probably more critical, although perhaps less a current issue amongst the public. But on those two issues, surely you must be directly involved.
Well, going with the small businesses again, you're absolutely right, and I hope we were as positive as you wanted us to be. It's hard to give specific targets just because of the risk management issue, and you can't predict demand or who the customers are. But if I left any doubt that we are committed to serving the small businesses in Britain, I apologize, because it's a business that's extremely important to us, and we recognize our obligation. Maybe you can say a few more words on that.
And if I might, we opened 100,000 start-up accounts last year for small businesses. That's the largest number of start-up accounts we've opened in the last 5 years.
How many did you close?
We closed very few indeed. We're there supporting our customers, lending money. As Bob has said, though, demand for credit, particularly in the SME segment, has contracted because customers are less confident about the future.
But Chairman, we have capacity to lend if there's demand. We have a willingness to lend, and it's not just because it's the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, but it's also our core business. Okay. We like lending to our customers.
All I would say to you,
Andy has one more quick question.
I have one final question, but I'd say in relation to small business finance, I've been used on one side. The banks are saying there's plenty of credit out there available. Small business organisations saying exactly the opposite. But we've now had the Bank of England in a very forthright report saying the terms of much of the finance that's available is too onerous for many small businesses, and I do think the banking sector needs to look carefully at that, and I hope it will do it through Merlin. The final question I want to ask you, and in a sense it's a plea, and it reflects the two main public responses to what has been happening in our banks, and in particular in relation to bonuses. We're always told we're all in this together. We're always told, the Deputy Prime Minister tells us, that banks live in a parallel universe to where everybody else lives, and I think that's been reflected round in the committee today. What can you say to us that will get us to understand that you understand exactly what the public feel about the way in which these issues are being handled by the banking sector?
Well, and I'll give Anthony a chance to speak to that as well, because it's an important question. I hope today was an opportunity for me to give a different perspective, and for me to give a perspective that although I would like to be able to isolate bonuses and solve an issue around bonuses without consequences on the rest of the business, that's not in my gift. I'm a businessman. Yeah. I'm running a business, and what I can pledge to you is that we're trying to balance what our owners want and our shareholders want with what's right for our clients and customers, whether it's a farmer in Wales or a businessman in Manchester, with 150,000 employees around the world, and a responsibility to the communities in which we work. And at Barclays, we are very responsible to our communities. And I know, and I'm aware, and Anthony's aware, and everyone's aware of the emotion around the issue of bonuses. And so what I've pledged is we recognize the need for as much restraint as is possible within the context of the other issues. and that we are responsible citizens of the world and citizens of the United Kingdom, and we do pledge that.
Michael Fallon.
When you were awarded your own bonus of I think it was 6.5 million in 2007, did the then Labour government ask you to forego any of it?
In 2007,
Yeah.
I don't recall anything to that effect. No.
When you decided to waive your bonus in 2008 and 2009, was that at the formal request of the then government?
No, sir.
In fact, did the last government ask you to forego any of your remuneration over the last 4 years?
Personally?
Yes.
No, sir.
Thank you.
While we're on remuneration, while we're on remuneration and trying to be a little less partisan, just to clarify the position on information to shareholders. Can I be clear that shareholders have not asked you for any information at all about this year's bonus round, and that you have not been in discussions with them about this year's bonus round?
Other than the ongoing discussions we have with major shareholders around the issues I talked about in terms of the process, the governance.
Yeah, we've discussed that.
Yeah. But sorry, I didn't want to give an incomplete answer. Other than that, there's been nothing specifically asked for by shareholders, but I would remind you that we haven't determined bonus pools yet.
Don't you find it surprising that shareholders, and you yourself have said that shareholders should play a major role and that you're accountable to them with respect to remuneration, in this year of all the most sensitive years, should not even have asked you for this information, still less tried to influence your decision?
Yeah, it's a little... The conversation is more nuanced, I think, than we're letting on.
Well, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's facts that...
No, there are conversations all the time with shareholders around how we run the business, and costs and compensation are a part of that. So I think to jump to the conclusion that they're uninterested, please don't assume that our shareholders aren't incredibly involved, incredibly bright, and good at what they do. They're very focused on evaluating Barclays as an investment. I think you've
they're
many shareholders as well.
They're interested, clever, and uninformed. I think that would be correct. Is there any aspect of what I've said there that you'd like to correct?
I think they're very informed about how we run Barclays.
But they don't know what on bonuses. They don't know what you're paying.
They don't have disclosure of individual numbers. That's
and they haven't asked for it. So they're recumbent, half asleep.
Well,
okay, that's a matter for.
I don't agree. I don't agree with how you characterize our shareholders.
Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jenkins, did you say there were 75,000 employees in the retail business around the world in Barclays?
It's about 70,000, yes.
Right, and their, as it were, bonus compensation would be of the order of £1,000 to £2,000 on average per person.
On average, yes.
So the average comp for them would be about 150 to 200 million pounds on that side of the business. Have I got that right? 75 times 1,000, 200,000 times 1,000.
You're talking about the variable component.
Yeah, the variable component.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the bonus side, if you like. What was the bonus pot for the whole bank 2 years ago, Mr. Dunn?
I haven't got the number off the top
I mean,
of my head. I know the compensation.
Of the order of 2 to 3 billion? I mean, before the pre-crash?
Prior to the crash?
Yeah.
Probably in that order.
So, in other words, the retail side of the bank, the 75,000 employees of the bank, half the employees of the bank, earned, or can expect to earn if the compensation pot is about the same now, about 6% of the total bonus pot. And 94% goes to the 75,000 people who are not on the retail side of the bank on those numbers.
I think the math may not be quite as extreme as you're articulating. But
I'm just drawing it out. I'm not making a claim.
As we previously discussed, the majority of the variable compensation regarding bonuses would accrue to the Barclays Capital colleagues. And the reason for that is exactly what Bob's been saying about paper performance and the nature of the market.
Right, but it does look as though, just cutting through it, the least well-off employees in the bank are getting 6 to 7 or 8% of the bonus pot, and the most well-off employees in the bank are getting 94% or 96, around about that number of the bonus cost. You don't disagree with roughly those numbers?
Well, of course, the logic is that the people who get more of the pot will be more well off as well.
Mr. Diamond, you've talked very eloquently about the bank taking deposits in 1690, and you've said that you could not be prouder of the build-up of Barclays Capital. And you must have been thrilled to become CEO.
Yes.
Having not, as it were, last time round when John Varley was appointed. So all the more so for that feeling of running the business in the interim?
John Varley was appointed I was a big supporter of John's then. So, yes. No, I was delighted. I said earlier, it's both an honor and I'm very motivated.
I mean, would you have done the job for nothing?
No leading question.
Again, you're asking about decisions that are not mine to make.
These bonuses are forced on you by the Remuneration Committee.
I raised the topic in a serious spirit because we are looking at a car crash taking place potentially in front of our eyes over the next few weeks and months in the clash between public expectations and outcomes in this issue. And it behoves us all to be very serious about it. And I think the public is not just looking for the usual answers, and it's not just looking for guarantees of future well-being. It is looking for some kind of payback, some kind of recompense. And so I want to ask you, Mr. Diamond, whether you think there are would you support the idea of a big society community fund into which your employees could be invited to voluntarily to put, say, 10% or a portion of their bonus as a gesture of the kind of community leadership you've talked about before?
There are 60,000 of our employees are actively involved in giving back personally of their time to the communities in which they work. The amount of money that's raised by putting a percentage of what we earn into our communities here in the UK and around the world, and the incredible amount that our employees give both of their time and of their compensation is something we're both proud of and we encourage. I think it's difficult in a public hearing like this to talk about any specific initiative away from all the things that are done at Barclays and the way that we want our employees to have a choice about those. Obviously, the big society has been part of discussions in Merlin, and I don't feel comfortable in discussing it. But in spirit, do I think our organization should be giving back to their communities? I certainly agree with you on that, and I think you would find, and I'd love you to come spend some time on some of the things we do. 60,000 of our employees. It's really amazing, and we give awards each year, and I will tell you, it's wonderful to see whether it's in Africa or whether it's in Scotland. It's around the world. So I think we agree in spirit. I don't think it's appropriate to discuss specific initiatives here.
Well, I would be grateful for the opportunity to do that and to put a specific proposal, if I might, to you in this area.
I'd be happy to spend that time offline. Yes.
Final question. I mean, it is evident from a corporate governance perspective that there has been a colossal failure of governance in the banking sector over the last few years, from which Barclays has largely been, I'm thrilled to say, exempt. But that many of them were run in the interests of their employees rather than the shareholders. Now, in the venture capital world, the normal practice is that the investor gets their money out before anyone takes any profit. I'm sure that would be true. I don't know if Barclays has a venture capital business, but I'm sure that would be true of its business if it did. Do you not think that's a more appropriate model within which some of the compensation arguments that are taking place should occur? The government should get its money back, the public should get their money back, and then, as it were, the issue of taking any profit or sharing any profit should take place after that.
Jesse, let me make one thing perfectly clear, and because you and I don't disagree in concept on many of these things, but you know, I've been heard to say many times over the years that strong banks want strong regulation. And at first, people would look at me like, "What are you talking about?" And being Barclays or being HSBC, where in this country a couple of large banks did fail and needed direct investment from the taxpayer and from the government. In the public's eyes, too often, we're all the same. They throw all banks as bad, and there's very little differentiation that a Barclays or an HSBC never put their organization at risk, were profitable through difficult cycles, stayed close to their clients. And I recognize it's not pleasant for us at Barclays that so many of the people just say all banks are bad and all banks made all the mistakes. And you know, banks did make mistakes, but I think we're very, very proud that we managed through this period profitably, improving the lives of our customers and our clients, improving the financial ratios of the bank, and I think that's a different position to be in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Andrew Lewis.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Diamond, I over Christmas read my 7-year-old The Emperor Has No Clothes, and I have to say, I feel very sad about this because having a great fondness and a great familiarity with Barclays, I think there is a fantastical or some kind of fantasy story going on here. I mean, you talk about universal banking, and certainly I recall from Barclays days, the dream was to get a multinational corporate's global banking, very, very rarely, if ever, achieved. And your argument for maintaining the status quo there is that, you know, multinational organisations need multinational banks. Just don't agree with you. Your argument about attracting the greatest talent. Everybody knows in every organisation you have perhaps 2 or 3% of true talent and the rest are all fungible. And we can have countless discussions about that. But there isn't that massive talent. Through 25 years in banking, I can absolutely vouch for that, as I'm sure you would over a few bottles of wine. In terms of banks are going to move, if we're nasty to them, they'll move. Just the evidence doesn't stack up. There's no evidence that suggests that banks are all going to move. You said yourself today that Barclays is a UK bank and is likely to stay here. I've had similar discussions with lots of other banks. It's extremely disappointing. You seem to just argue for the status quo for its own sake. You're in denial about the extent to which the taxpayer has supported you, to David Ruffley there. You talk about you're run by your shareholders, and yet we absolutely know that's not true. Corporate governance, particularly the banking sector, has simply not been strong enough. They don't have enough information. You're denying a lack of competition in the UK. You're claiming high levels of customer satisfaction, hugely challenged throughout the industry. And you're claiming to support SMEs, which the CBI, the FSB, they just don't agree with you. And it just seems to me that the emperor has no clothes. When we talked about bringing in a banker, I was jumping up and down saying, oh, can we have Bob Diamond? Because in the real hope that you would, as an investment banker, have a very clear and cynical and thorough perspective on what's going on in the banking world. But you've given us nothing. And going back to what Jessie was just saying about who gets paid out first, surely the reason bonuses are so obscene dates back to the days of partnerships, the small investment banking partnerships, where liabilities were unlimited, and that has simply gone, but the remuneration is upside only. It's like playing blackjack. You keep playing and playing until you blow up, because there is no downside to you individually. Is that not the case?
No, I would disagree with many things you said. I think.
Oh, good.
I think to start with, I think, and this is. I apologize because this is going to sound like I'm pushing back a little bit, and I suppose I am. But to be perfectly frank, I don't think your experience at BZW wouldn't support exactly what I said. It was a very small, domestic, post-Big Bang UK investment bank. In its entire history, it never made any money outside of the UK or outside of its core UK business. And frankly, it got trampled by the US bulge bracket firms. When I began with Barclays Capital, and we sold parts of BZW and used parts of them to fold in, and because you talked about competition as well, one of the problems of BZW is there were only about 2 or 3% of people that deserve their compensation. What I was shocked at in my first year there is over 30% of the people in BZW got no bonus. And it was my first year, so I said, we've got to peel back the onion. Something's going on. If we give them no bonus, you'd expect me to say this, they're going to leave. So we peeled back the onion. And of the 30% of the people that got no bonus, most of them hadn't had a bonus in 4 or 5 years. They were unemployable. And there wasn't a focus on talent, and there wasn't a global talent pool. And when we began in Barclays Capital, I was very frustrated that Barclays, this prestigious 290-year-old bank, if I have my math correctly, was not even in the top 25 in foreign exchange in the world of doing transactions. And worse, I went to the UK corporate clients, Tesco, BT, they're doing all their foreign exchange with Morgan Stanley and with Goldman Sachs, and I can see how wide the spreads are. And by investing in technology, the BARCS platform, which gets straight through processing to our corporate clients, by tightening the spreads so they get a better deal, we're the first bank in 3 decades that's moved into the top 3 in foreign exchange, and we've wrestled back the UK corporate business from the US bulge bracket firms, and our customers are getting better business. So yes, I do disagree with you. I think your experience at BZW supports exactly what I'm talking about talent, about focus, about pay for performance. And we need to recognize that actions have consequences. And we do recognize that there is anger against bankers. And I have said we've made mistakes. I've certainly made mistakes, but I also feel I've been part of an organization that has been incredibly successful during a very tough period and now wants to be part of driving economic growth and driving job creation and working more closely with the private sector. We also support the UK government. When they issue gilts to finance the deficit, those gilts aren't bought by UK pension funds. They're bought by the Bank of Japan, they're bought by banks in China, and it takes an operation like Barclays Capital. It's why we've been the lead manager of, I think, 5 of the last 8 gilt operations or funding operations. I think, as I say it, we can't isolate bonuses. We would like to isolate bonuses and say, make this go away and let's have everything else the same. But we can't do that. I can't do that as a job. It's not within my gift.
It was a very broad question. You gave a very broad answer. Can I pick up on just one point Andrea asked, which was about unlimited liability, and linking it to what you said right at the beginning, a couple of hours ago. What disadvantage do you think would pertain to banking if chief executives were subject to unlimited liability? While you're thinking about the best reply to that, it's worth bearing in mind that you yourself have now said that there's this anger against bankers that needs to be addressed. From the public's perspective, might this not be an approach that should be considered?
Well, I think hopefully today is a good start at trying to see the other side of the story of the bonus debate, of why it is important to get balance and why this is important for job creation. And I think if you start to
on the unlimited liability
point, let me take unlimited liability, but take Bob Diamond out of it. Take me personally out of it.
I said chief executives.
You have a majority ownership in 2 UK banks. I think you hired a terrific person to come in and turn around Royal Bank of Scotland and Stephen Hester. Would you be able to attract someone of that caliber if there was unlimited liability? That's the question you have to ask. You just hired another outstanding individual. His contract is also on display. It's very similar to the others at Lloyd's in Antonio. Would you be able to have hired, and what would have been the best decision for the United Kingdom? To get the best person with a track record like Antonio, with a competitive compensation package, which is what he has. His is very similar to mine. And it's very competitive, and I think he is the best guy. As a competitor,
so if
I say Lloyd's just got a great chief executive, it's going to be tough on me. So that's the right thing to do for the United Kingdom, is to get those banks turned around, get them back into the private sector. There is no example, Chairman, if I can say one more thing. I don't know a single example in history, and I'd love to hear from all of you, where a nationally directed financial institution over time didn't end in tears. The Landesbanks we're seeing right now in Germany, the Cajas in Spain, Fannie and Freddie in the U.S., building societies to some extent here, nationally directed financial institutions are not the right way to go.
But just to be clear, your answer to my question is you wouldn't get the chief
I don't think
executives
you
you
get a
need
chief
for the
executive.
job, and therefore, in Andrea's terms, we've got to carry on playing blackjack.
I really resent the fact that you would refer to this as blackjack or casino banking or rogue trading, and I've given the reasons why I resent that. I think it's wrong. I think it's unfair. I think it's a poor choice of words. You have some fantastically strong financial institutions in this country, and frankly, they deserve better.
I'm sure you understand we're articulating many of the things that have been put to us by others. Chukaramana.
I think the thing is, Mr. Diamond, in some respects, most people just think the system's screwed and we should change it for want of putting it a better way. And you're saying to us that's the system as it is, but I think...
No, I'm not. That's
you're
not
not.
True.
You recognise it.
Let's just talk about the changes. So let's talk about the changes in the last 3 years. Barclays 3 years ago. I'll use Barclays as an example in the industry. Barclays operated on 5% equity. When the RBS transaction was approved, I think it was 2 or 2.5% equity when their ABN AMRO transaction. Today we're at 10% equity. Our leverage was 35 to 1. Today it's about 20 or 21 to 1. The liquidity we hold on our balance sheet was 20 to 25 billion pounds in cash or cash equivalents to make the system safe and sound. Today we're running at 150 billion pounds plus in cash or cash equivalents on the balance sheet. The way we do business, one of my big challenges and AJ's big challenges and our management team is how do we operate this institution, to your point on small businesses, with much higher cost of capital or much higher levels of capital and therefore higher cost of credit. How do we keep credit flowing to consumers and to small businesses? Because you're right. Their reacting of the terms of lending is much higher now than it was a few years ago, and that's how we have to go forward. We have to find ways to get that flow of credit back to business, even though the cost of credit has increased.
Can I ask you, and you're probably, I mean, I'm slightly bonused out right now.
That's not
you're probably feeling exactly the same. No, I want to actually move on to choice and competition because when we had Eric Daniels here from Lloyds, to the incredulity of the majority of the committee, he was asserting that your sector across different markets, whether it's credit card providers, mortgage lending, personal currency accounts, was very competitive despite the increasing consolidation and market concentration that you've seen, and despite the fact that generally in all the different parts of the market I've just mentioned, there are 5 or 6 large providers which have a much greater share of those individual markets as compared to, say, in other countries, Germany, the US, France, for example. Now, in the written submission that you put in on this point, you noted the significant change in consolidation in retail banking over the last few years that I've just talked about, but yet you conclude that the landscape remains competitive and dynamic. In some senses, that's exactly what Eric Daniels said to us. How on earth can this be, Mr. Diamond?
It is one of the fundamental questions that this inquiry is trying to address. And let me try and talk about it from a few different perspectives. Firstly, and I think Mr. Daniels made this point, there are many providers in the categories of personal current accounts, SME, savings and so on. The basis of competition in the UK is on price. It's also on product feature functionality and on service. If you open up the financial press over the weekend, you would have seen that many of the papers were talking about a war for personal loan pricing, certain mortgage categories getting much more aggressive, savings rates improving. So you do see evidence of price competition. I would also say on service, and I would just like to refer back to Andrea's point, we are in no way happy with the level of satisfaction of our customers at Barclays. We see that as a competitive advantage. And that's why we've just, for example, retooled our debit card reissue process and collapsed the time it takes from 7 to 8 business days down to 48 hours. The consequence of that was one of our customers actually went through that experience and wrote to the Sunday Times saying what a great experience it was. Why do we do that? Because we think we can get more customers and serve more customers over time. So I think whether it's pricing, whether it's service, or or product feature functionality, we have over 170 open branches in the UK with open counters, no banded screens, no glass between us and the customer. Customers really like that. By the time we've done refurbishing the branch network, that will be 400 branches with that facility. We have 8 million contactless debit and credit cards in issue in the UK. That's 5 times what any other bank has. So we're competing on price, we're competing on service, we're competing on product, feature, functionality. And so the question is, in a sense, is it getting more intense or less intense? Because I do think economic wisdom would suggest that you at least have to ask the question when a market consolidates.
But the thing is, I mean, I recognise some of what you've said, not least because...
The final point I would make, and
sure.
I'm sorry to be long-winded, but the final point I would make is, empirically, if you look at what some of the other witnesses to your inquiry in their evidence, they are interested in entering this market, and in many cases are entering this market, and they're also picking off pieces of the market that they find particularly attractive. So my view is that the answer on the competitive nature of the market is actually quite complex, and we are probably seeing competition increasing with some of the new entrants that are coming into the market.
And I kind of, I mean, as I said, I recognise some of what you say. One of these branches you just talked about has opened in the centre of the universe, which is my constituency. But I mean, I'm not sure I buy what you're saying, partly because if you say, look, in the personal current account market, and this is something that Andrea's brought up with various people who've given evidence, there's very little switching by customers. And are you seriously saying that, the disappearance of so many firms and the consolidation that there has been hasn't had and wouldn't have an impact on competition?
I'm saying that the question is quite a subtle one. So let me just talk as a practitioner, as somebody who's out there doing business every day. It doesn't feel easy for me to go and win a current account, to win a savings account, to win a mortgage from customers. We have to go and compete on those things. The question of switching, which I know has been discussed extensively at the inquiry, has got better, has in fact led to an increase in the rate of switching.
It's from quite a relatively low base, isn't it, Mr. Jenkins?
And I would say that most customers would find that process relatively straightforward. And again, there was coverage in the financial press over the weekend making that very point. The other point on switching, of course, is that most customers have 2.4 accounts. Many of those are with different institutions, so they try before they buy.
How long would it take for me to change my account, say, at NatWest to you at Barclays, or vice versa? Do you know how long? I mean, one thing that has come out in the evidence that we've received thus far is that it's incredibly difficult to change and switch, and it takes some time, and it isn't so easy, partly because of the transmission systems that are in place.
Yes. My evidence is that switching would take between 5 to 10 business days to close the account and open the new one. There may be a period of 2 or 3 weeks after that when the direct debits get switched over, which is a process which is operated by the originators of those direct debits. And at Barclays, what we do is we make sure that the customer is not disadvantaged in that process. For example, we provide an interest-free overdraft for 90 days while everything settles down and the salary check comes into the account and so on. So the industry has, I think, come a long way in terms of making the switching process easier for customers. And we do see switching in the UK, and in many categories of product, we see intense competition. For example, Barclaycard right now has a 17-month balance transfer offer out in the market. That's the longest balance transfer offer that there is out there. We're very competitive on mortgage, on savings, and so on.
Quick question from Andy Love, and then Stuart Hosey.
I want to ask you the general question about barriers to entry, because others have come to the committee and said that the implicit subsidy, the fact that there is such concentration makes it almost impossible for them to enter the market. But the question, in a sense, I want to put to you is, it's also been put to us that if you had portability of account numbers, this would make the difference to switching and make it much easier. How does Barclays respond to portability of account numbers?
Yes. Again, another topic here. On portability, our view is that the switching process has been made much easier. Now, of course, it is possible to create a portable account number for customers. There is no doubt about that. With enough time and money, the technology exists to do that. However, in my view, as a practitioner, the cost of doing that would be very significant, at least in the hundreds of millions, probably in the billions. That cost would have to be recovered. Ultimately, it would have to be paid for by the customer. So the real question is, does the benefit of improving the switching process outweigh the cost? And our view would be that it would not. Essentially, in addition to the investment required to retool the whole payments infrastructure, there would be a massive opportunity cost in the deflection of technology resources to that sort of activity away from some of the innovations that I was referencing before in terms of branch refurbishment, mobile, internet, contactless, and so on.
Perhaps you can give us any further thoughts you have on that particular issue, which is of particular interest to one or two of us, several of the committee, in
on
writing.
Account portability in particular.
Stuart Hosey.
But Bob, first, you spoke about the increase in the Tier 1 capital to 10%, the liquidity buffer increasing to 160 billion, and the leverage ratio reducing from 35 times to 20 times. And that's all good. But in your submission, the impact of regulatory reform on competition, you said that prudential reforms to strengthen financial stability, quotes, will make it more difficult for banks to achieve target returns on capital that are acceptable to shareholders. I'm just wanting to check, you wouldn't intend or seek to roll back Basel III in any way, would you?
No, not at all. It's a good question. What we are saying, though, is that and the only difference I'd say to what you said, it was core equity I talked about, not Tier 1. But if I said Tier 1, I apologize. Core equity. It's hard to say did Basel come out perfectly, and you'll get different views from people. But we think, by and large, these higher capital ratios do make the system safer and sounder, and we can operate within them. I would give a caveat that there's still some things that haven't been certain. Is there an additional buffer for countercyclicality? Is there an additional buffer for strategically important financial institutions where we think we would fall within that? So it's not final. And the other thing that's been terrific, I think, is it has been truly a G20 coordination. As you know, the U.S. banks weren't even on Basel II. So to have the U.S. banks on a different capital ratio. So we're broadly pleased. But what I would say, and I think this is important for the committee to understand, if you look at bank returns on average, before the crisis, they were kind of 15 to 20%. But that's not real. That was for a period of really what we all look at now and see it was kind of excess liquidity, very easy monetary policy. And if I can say it this way, bank returns weren't as challenging. And so on average, they were 15 to 20. But if you look over 20 or 30 or 40 years, bank returns average more like 12 to 14%, 10 to 12, 12 to 14. And I think if we take into account the changes in the macroeconomics, deleveraging of consumers, deleveraging of corporates, that's going to reduce the returns. If we look at the impact of Basel capital, that's going to reduce returns, I would say, by 3, 4, or 5%. So you're looking, if there are no actions, and there will be actions, then you're down to kind of 4 to 6% in terms of average returns, and that's the issue. And the challenge will be for banks to learn to operate in the new environment with higher capital. Now, one of the challenges our shareholders really push me on is to convince them that Barclays can earn above the cost of equity, and that will be one of the things I talk about when I give the results presentation and my first chance to talk in February. So, Stuart, I think your question's the right one. This will put pressure on banks, and if I can say it this way, it's going to be particularly difficult for banks with a weak model or a model that has weak performing units to it. So the difference between the returns of strong banks versus weak banks, banks maybe that have a bad business model or just a weak client base or carrying businesses that had subpar returns, will get more and more challenging. So I do think probably not as much in the UK, but I would expect across Europe to see significant restructuring of financial institutions.
That's several, and I'm sure we might want to come back to that, but not today. Anthony, in the same submission, talking about the capital ratios and the rest, it said it would make entry into the banking market less attractive, but you said in your last answer you felt competition was increasing. So what would you do to mitigate the risk that regulatory reform would be a barrier to entry for new entrants? Or do you really think that's the case?
Well, of course, if you have to hold more capital to enter a market, it's going to make the bar higher to get into that market, and I think that's what the paragraph was referring to. What I was referring to in my remarks was that what we see is empirical evidence of new players entering the market, not only in the consumer market, but also in the SME market, where we have some very focused players now coming back in, Albemarle, Handelsbank, and so on, that are starting to underwrite significant pieces of business. So, notwithstanding the increased capital requirements, there are competitors who are either in the market or seeking to increase their position in the market or seeking to enter the market because they believe they can extract profitable returns from certain segments of the market.
In the knowledge that these new capital requirements will be there?
Yes.
Shukramana has one last rejoinder.
One very quick question on Basel III, and obviously I think a 7% by 2019 capital requirement. I mean, that seems quite low to me. And I think Alan Greenspan has suggested 15%, if I'm not mistaken. Would you welcome having even more stringent capital requirements? What do you think about, say, 15%? I mean, 7% seems very low to me.
Well, keep in mind that I think we don't know yet whether or not there will be an additional buffer for SIFIs, strategically important financial institutions, and certainly we would expect in the UK a couple of us would be considered. Now, what the U.S. regulators have said, Secretary Geithner has said, is he doesn't think they should add to the 7%. He thinks it's perfectly adequate. And I think if you ask the U.S. banks and you ask them how they're operating, they would say that 7% feels more like 10 or 11% because no bank is going to risk, going close to those levels. So on balance, I think it would be a mistake for the UK to be super equivalent in terms of increasing the capital requirements for UK banks above the Basel rules and whatever's agreed.
Do you think the US guys are right on this?
I would like to see clarity and definity, and to some extent we feel like we can operate in any environment as long as it's the same for all of our competitors. My sense is that 7% is a pretty good change, and that if banks were operating kind of with a cushion above that at kind of 9% to 10%, that would be a much safer and sounder financial system, but still allow us to be increasing capacity for lending and doing business. So as usual, and I know you know this, but it's a balance between the two. It's been a balance between how do we make the system safer and sounder, and how do we encourage jobs and economic growth and lending and healthy risk-taking.
Thank you very much for coming before us this afternoon. It's been a marathon session of 2.5 hours. We've ranged widely, and we're very grateful to you both for coming. We perhaps haven't done as much on competition as we should, but we've certainly touched on a number of important issues for the public outside. In normal conditions, some of the questions might have been considered a little intrusive, but I'm sure you understand these are not normal conditions. And we're very grateful for your evidence today.
Happy to be here, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman.